Hi, and welcome to the new EOS online subscription system. Today we will be discussing how to create a workflow for the system, as well as assign the roles and how to create what each role can access through the workflow according to the organization structure in order to process and for the system to understand how the order and the purchase request and the online subscription request will be processed. Let's begin. The first thing that we're going to go to is the roles and workflow tab. Once we go to that menu item, we will be faced with three subcategories. The first one is workflow, the second one is the workflows tab, and the last one is the role sequence. And we will go to each of them individually. The first one is the workflow. So once we open that, we will be faced with the normal, again, EOS systems filters, including the in use, not in use, all records, the number of entries, the search bar, the grid, as well as the export bar option that has multiple variety, including the print option, the CSV, the PDF, and Excel, or even copying to the clipboard. The workflow is this step is just an identifier to create a new workflow or assign a workflow for the system depending on each school. In order to create a new workflow, we just click simply on New Workflow. Once we do, we will be prompted to the page that we can just put in the name, a code, and a description for it. And once we get that done, as has been made here, it will be added to the grid below. Accordingly, we can edit or delete. Each school dynamically can create their own workflow depending on their needs, and this is one of the main key features within the system that allows each organization to dynamically create their own workflow depending on the school structure. Once we created and assigned the workflow as a record, we need to create the workflow steps. And of course, again, this is depending on each organization and how they want to be processing their requests or for the online subscription or ordering the online subscription. The first of the page, again, we will be faced with the normal table as we mentioned before, the filters for the in use, not in use, the amount of entries, the search bar, the export bar. And as you can see, the grid itself has many key features that indicating what is related regarding the work steps. It has the what workflow related to, so in each organization there can be multiple workflows, and each of them can include multiple steps depending on each workflow and how they're going to assign it. It will have a step number, a code, a name, and a status, including if it's going to be an email sent for notification or not. So let us dig in. First of all, in order to create a new step, we need to click on New Step. It will allow us to go to the page in order to create the new step. We will be required to create a code, a name, as well as choosing the workflow assigned to it, which is one of the key reasons that we mentioned that each school can have one workflow or dynamically all the workflows that they need. There are three checkboxes in here. It's initial state, last state, and send notification email. Each one of them indicates one information about the step. The initial state is indicating the first step within the states or the steps that is going to be taken within the creation of the workflow and steps. The last state is to indicate that this is the last step that's going to be within the workflow, and that needs to be only checked in the last stage, on the last step that's going to be created for the workflow. Send notification email is a checkbox that basically alerts and allows the system to understand that in each step, all the configured parties, including the requester and the approval, whoever is going to be requesting and sending to the next step, will be both notified about every other step until it's done, until it's out of the cycle. If we can assign, you can see in here as well that there is an indicator that allows you to add step numbers, and in here like a color palette to choose the coloring for the steps to indicate what stage is the step. As you can see from the stages here, the color will be shown in this part, and the step number will be in here, as well as the code and the name for it. For example, as you can see, the code is short for the name, which is the most preferable method to create those in order to make sure that it's understandable and easy to configure. If you can check with us here, the first one is an initial state, and once it's made, it does not allow email, which is the draft page. Once we request for approval, it is required by email, but there's not an initial state or a final state. And this will keep going until the last stage, which is the complete stage, Accordingly, then we identify it as the final state. In this way, the system will understand what does it mean by the workflow and how will it process the request depending on the structure that you base in the workflow within your organization. The last one is the role sequence. The role sequence, it will show, as you can see, it has all the same filters as we discussed before, the filters, the amount of entries, the export, search bar, but the main key feature in the role step or the role sequence is this. It will identify the logic, how the workflow for the request will be processed. In order to create a new role, we just click on plus here in the new role, and you will be faced with a couple of items. First of all, we'll put a code and a name, of course, for the role sequence. After that, this here indicates multiple options for each role sequence. For example, to create a new document, it means to create a new request. And this step, if we say that it requests the person's approval who is assigned to this role, then it will allow him to request an approval. If it doesn't, then it will pass him and get passed after. Allow sending orders for approval. This allows this step, the orders to be given to the user in order to be able to send the request or request approval. And of course, there are multiple checkboxes in here related to the type of the role and which the order related to. The first one is school related, which doesn't relate to any academics. Section related, which is depending on each school section. The year group related, which is in case of year groups. And subject related in case of department and the requests. We need to put a description, choose a workflow, and as we mentioned before, if you have multiple workflow, depending on the workflow and the roles, the system will understand how the cycle will work for the order. And we choose where the action starts from and where it ends from. For example, if we choose the workflow here, we choose where does it start to. Once we create, this action starts from and ends from is the actual workflow step that we created before. We created the workflow. Accordingly, we created how the steps is going to be following each other, and now we make the system understand how the steps will be processed and understood in order to follow the logic of the workflow that we needed to be done. So we can say it starts from draft and it ends, for example, request a whole school principal approval, and we need to put that in sequence. So this is the first one in sequence, and then the second level of sequence. Creation of the role sequence is like a tree. You create the levels, and each one of them, depending on your workflow and your school structure, it allows you dynamically to make the system as wide as you need it or as short as you need it, depending on your requirement and your organization structure and size. So to get back to the example, we'll go to the main page to show mainly what is it. For example, we said that this workflow is the approval workflow. This is the first step of the sequence. We have two types of approval cycles, one through the department requester and one from a year group requester, depending on the in our example. The year group requester, for example, they can both create a draft as well as create a department approval. Once the head, if it's the case of department requester, request the head of department. In case of the year group requester, it will request the head of year approval. And then followingly, each step, depending on the workflow, will be linked to the other one following regarding. So meaning, like the head of department will go from the head of department to the following one to the deputy head, and the deputy head will go to the principal, and the principal will go to the whole school principal, and the whole school principal will go to the director, and it will go finally for approval. Accordingly, when we assign each step, as you can see, all the previous steps are added due to the fact that we need to structure the steps and the actions, the line of action, in order to make the system understand what is the approved line of action for this workflow. As you can see, for example, the department requester has an only draft, but if we go to the head of department, the action will start from draft and then request the head of department approval, and then it goes to the deputy head approval. Or in our case, we can add an additional step if needed or change it. Each one of the sequence, as we mentioned before, indicates how the line of work will go, how the workflow steps will be processed. If after that, for example, if we go to the deputy head, it will show the draft, required deputy head approval, required head of department approval, or the head of year approval, and then the final step is the request for the principal. Because the deputy head is a role that can match with both, we put both workflows steps on here in order to make sure that the step or the action starting, whatever the cycle is from here or from here, it will go to the final step, which is in the next step, the principal. Once we go to the principal, we will find that again, the draft, then the deputy head approval or the head of department approval, head of year approval, and then the principal approval. Once this step is requested, then we need to go to the whole school principal approval. If not, we are still in this step. As long as we are within this sequence, the step does not go until the following step. And this part concludes what we were trying to explain to you regarding the steps. Each organization, and this is determined of course by the organization itself, will need to create its role sequence as well as its steps and workflow in order to make sure that the system understands and maintains the hierarchy of the organization. Until the next video, hope you stay safe